So this is a video from Mike Girvin earlier tonight, and what he's trying to solve is similar to something that I was doing a little while ago. So here we have column A, we have some names. In row 3, we have some assignments. So this is some kind of a class. And what we want to do is whenever we have the nose for a particular person, let's say here we have Bill. So we've selected Bill from the drop-down list. We look at Bill in row 5, and what we want to do for every time we see an N for no, we want to look above, get that column header, so quiz 1, quiz 2, and quiz 4, and we want to list it down in here. So this is dynamic. If I change this to be Phil, he has several things that are not completed. So here's Phil over here, test 1, test 2, quiz 1, quiz 2, and way over here, test 3. So we have all of those things listed here. And Mike, there's a bunch of stuff in here in the solution, but basically it is the aggregate function that is used to do the heavy lifting to solve this. So this is something that I've seen a bunch of videos with the aggregate function, but it's not really a part of my active toolkit, meaning that I can't just use this really quickly and be able to create something and explain it back to someone. So I wanted to practice this. I'll also show you the way I solved it. So let's look at what I have. Here is sort of our requirement. We want to look for a selected code and country. So first of all, we go over here. In this list, we pick a country. It's got this code with it as well. So this is just sort of dummy data, but this says Austria. Then what do we do? Well, return the column headers for each number match in the same row. So what does that mean? Well, here we have Austria. We have some conditional formatting that I added, but we have Austria. What's beside Austria in column B is this number. Okay, so we've got this number here. And then what we want to do is in this same row for Austria, any numbers that match this number, we then want to look up and grab that column header. So we want to get this one, we want to get that one, another 128, get this one, another 128, get that one, and we want to display them across the top. So you see how I've done this with an array formula. Now, I'll quickly review the array, but basically it's just a bunch of conditions. Conditions mean that column A, which is the list of countries, has to be the same as what we've selected here, which is B3. Next is column B, back over in sheet data, has to be the same as with the 128, which we have right there. So if I click on the side of here, you see how we're referring to cell D3 for the second condition here. The third condition in the array, and these asterisks means and. Condition 1, and condition 2, and condition 3. Condition 3 is the whole block, this whole block of text which has height and width, which is in here, this whole thing in here, and those numbers have to be the same as the 128, which is right there, D3, once again. So when all three of these conditions are true, that's our logical test, all three have to be true, we go and get the column number because we want to horizontally be able to identify where they are. And if they're not all true, then we don't care, we put a blank. So this whole thing produces a bunch of numbers, a bunch of column numbers, right? Looking back in here, it would have the column numbers for here, 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 and here, all right? And we can't really do much with them. We don't want to average them. That doesn't make any sense. What we want to do is extract them one by one by one. So we use this, of all those numbers, which one do we want? Well, that's the K. We want the smallest one. We want the second smallest, third smallest over here. That's what we want to do. And then in the very end, all this array is doing, this big long thing, this whole thing, if I press the F9 key, it's just giving us a number. And this index, it's a one-dimensional index. It just goes across the top in row 1, and we're telling it we want the 14th one. That's all it does. So it goes all the way across. But you might notice there's this one little bit here at the very beginning because we want to make this efficient. If I take that out, if I take this out, it will still work. Let's just take a quick look. I'll do Control Shift Enter, and I will drag this over. It still works, but now we're getting these errors because the array keeps trying to do work. So what we want to tell it to do in this case is to stop. As soon as we have our fourth one, this is a counter over here. So I'm using this this array to count how many 128s we have for Austria over here in our data in row 15. So we've got 4 of them. So as soon as we pull back the 4th column header, 1, 2, 3, 4, we want the array just to stop and not do any more work. That's why I go back and I put in this little if statement, this counter. Let's go over here. So here the counter is saying if L2 is greater than G3, then blank. Well, that's not true because we have to get the 4th one. But as soon as we're here, now we're saying if 5 is greater than 4, then just do blank. Don't do this long, complex, heavy formula. Just do nothing. So this is a much more efficient way to do it. To tell just even, all of these cells, they're not even calculating this array. They're just doing the blank with that little tiny if statement, which is actually pretty powerful. All right, so if you scroll to the bottom, I've also sort of laid out a description so you can sort of look at the 3 conditions, get column numbers if true, true, true for our 3 array conditions. If it's not, we want a blank, we don't care. And then this whole thing here, the small function is just saying, give me a bunch of column numbers, and we're saying extract the smallest 1, the smallest 2, smallest 3, and all of this line here, all of this just gives us a number which feeds into the index. And at the very, very beginning, of course, is that if statement. This if statement here to say, to let it quit and not do any work. So this is Mike's solution, and I've just adapted it, and I really wanted to try to work with this. I was able to create this pretty quickly, but my challenge is trying to describe it. That's where I was having a hard time. So let's go down here and look at this whole thing that I built to describe it. First of all, the aggregate function is extremely flexible, and they have these little numbers that you can do different things with, but in this case we put a 15 for small. Similar to the array, we want to extract the numbers one by one that qualify. Next is ignore errors. This little 6, if we go back to the top here, that 6, which is right there, there's different options, and you'll have to explore them. There's not enough time to walk through all of them, but the 6 will just ignore the errors. So the next thing is this. We go down here, and boy, what do we have here? Well, Mike does this excellent method that I have to get used to as well. I overused Excel's offset function to bring back a collection of numbers. But this formula, when you put this 0 at the end, or I could even take out the 0 and it would still work, this will actually work to go over here and get all of these numbers, to get all of those numbers all the way across to the right in the row where we find Austria. That's a very cool thing how it works. But get all numbers from the row that matches the selected country, and then the next thing that we do, we take all of those. Are these numbers equal to the selected country number, right? So let's go back to the top and take a quick look at that. We have our index and our match. It goes and gets all of those values. Let's see if I can actually display that and show you what's in there. I need to highlight exactly this, press the F9 key, and so I've done something wrong here. Let me just go back and do this again. We want to go right in here, it looks like. Highlight exactly that, press the F9 key. Sure enough, there are all the numbers from that row. So we're going to compare all these numbers with D7. D7 is 128. So now what's going to happen is if I go back, highlight this, all the way over to that D7, which is right, I have to highlight this just perfectly. Let's highlight this. Oh, that's too much. Let's just go in here, highlight that, F9. Now we get a bunch of true or false values. So what do we do with that? Well, this whole thing is so interesting. It is challenging to describe, but all those true and false values, we want to say, okay, I've got a counter here. So I made this uh, maybe a little bit simpler, not quite as dynamic, but it does the same thing. I'm using all these numbers in row 2. It goes all the way to row 28. Why are there 28 of them? Let's just press F9. There's 28 of them because our data set has 28 columns wide. From column D to column AE, that is 28 wide. So we need a counter that can do that for us. So back in here, this little guy right there. That is the counter with 1 to 28, and we actually divide by this other part that I just showed you, which is right in there. So such an interesting way to do it. We take this and we go all the way across. Now we're getting all those little counters, 1 to 28, divided by our true, false, true, false. Watch what happens when I press F9. So now we're going to get a bunch of errors, but we also have the row numbers, or those sort of location numbers that we want. So we have a 5, we have a 9, we have an 11, and those numbers we're going to use. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to extract these numbers one by one by one, because our k value means we want the first one. Over here, now we want the second one. So we do this whole thing, we calculate all this, and we get the second of all those column numbers or position numbers that are stuck inside of here. Now we're telling it the 15 is the small, 6, ignore the error so it doesn't destroy our formula, uh, and we want the second smallest, the third smallest, the fourth smallest, going back into our data. So extremely interesting, the aggregate function. It takes a while to get used to it, and it also takes a while to be able to describe it, as in my case. So now that we have all of that, we're doing the same thing here. At the very beginning, we're just doing that counter to say, if this number is greater than that number, just don't even do the math. Don't do the formula. Make it really efficient. So you see here, it's already stopped because 5 is greater than 4. It just puts a blank. It doesn't do this whole long thing. You don't want to wrap all of this with if error. That's going to be a lot slower, especially in a large data set. So this goes all the way across, they're just blanks, and that populates. So let's test this to make sure it works. I've got this one sort of wired to that one. So if we change this, and let's put the Bahamas, there are also 4 for the Bahamas. We'd go back here. Now it's highlighted, it's 165. All of these that match this one, we want those column headers. It goes and get them, and wow. Such an interesting way to do it, and I'm really glad I watched Mike's video. Now I'm much more comfortable with this aggregate function, and how Mike does this magic inside of here to solve it in a different way, not always using the array like I like to do. So if we go to the bottom, we also have this where I sort of describe it. You see this method, which was Mike's solution 2. The way I did it was solution 1, and they're both really good to know. And thanks, Mike, for the video. I'm glad I finally learned how to use the aggregate function.